Part 2. The Man in Grey. Chapter 6. The Time-Saving Bank. Life holds one great but quite commonplace mystery. Though shared by each of us and known to all, it seldom rates a second thought. That mystery, which most of us take for granted and never think twice about, is time. Calendars and clocks exist to measure time, but that signifies little because we all know that an hour can seem an eternity or pass in a flash according to how we spend it. Time is life itself, and life resides in the human heart. The man in grey knew this better than anyone. Nobody knew the value of an hour or a minute or even of a single second as well as they. They were expert on time just as leeches are experts on blood, and they acted accordingly. They had designs on people's time, long-term and well-laid plans of their own. What mattered most to them was that no one should become aware of their activities. They had surreptitiously installed themselves in the city. Now, step by step and day by day, they were secretly invading its inhabitants' lives and taking them over. They knew the identity of every person likely to further their plans long before that person had any inclining of it. They waited for the ideal moment to entrap them, and they saw to it that the ideal moment came. One such person was Mr. Figaro, the barber. Though not by any means a high-class hairdresser, he was well respected in the neighborhood. Neither rich nor poor, he owned a small barber shop in the center of town and employed an apprentice. One day Mr. Figaro was standing at the door of his shop waiting for customers. It was the apprentice's day off, so he was alone. Raindrops were spattering the pavement and the sky was bleak and dreary as Mr. Figaro's mood. Life's passing me by, he told himself, and what am I getting out of it? Wielding a pair of scissors, chatting to customers, lathering their faces. Is that the most I can expect? When I'm dead, it'll be as if I had never existed. In fact, Mr. Figaro had no objection at all to chatting. He liked to air his opinions and hear what his customers thought. He had no objection to wielding a pair of scissors or lathering faces either. He genuinely enjoyed his work and knew he did it well. Few barbers could shave the underside of a man's chin as smoothly against the lie of the subtle stubble, but there were times when none of this seemed to matter. I'm an utter failure, thought Mr. Figaro. I mean, what do I amount to? A small-time barber, that's all. If only I could lead the right kind of life, I'd be a different person altogether. Exactly what form the right kind of life should take, Mr. Figaro wasn't sure. He vaguely pictured it as a distinguished and affluent existence, such as he was always reading about in glossy magazines. The trouble is, he thought sourly, my work leaves me no time for that sort of thing, and you need time for the right kind of life. You've got to be free, but I'm a lifelong prisoner of scissors, leather, and chit-chat. At that moment, a smart grey limousine pulled up right outside Mr. Figaro's barbershop. A grey-suited man got out and walked in. He deposited his grey briefcase on the ledge in front of the mirror, hung his grey bowler on the head rack, sat down in the barber's chair, produced a grey notebook from his breast pocket and started leafing through it, puffing meanwhile at a small grey cigar. Mr. Figaro shut the street door because he suddenly found it strangely chilly in his little shop. "What's it to be?" he asked. "Shave or haircut?" Even as he spoke, he cursed himself for being so tactless. The stranger was as bald as an egg. The man in grey didn't smile. "Neither," he replied in a peculiarly flat and expressionless voice. A grey voice, so to speak. "I'm from the Timesaving Bank. Permit me to introduce myself, agent number XYQ384B. We hear you wish to open an account with us." "That's news to me," said Mr. Figaro. "To be honest, I didn't even know such a bank existed." "Well, you know now," the agent said crisply. He consulted his little grey notebook. "Your name is Figaro, isn't it?" "Correct," said Mr. Figaro. "That's me." "Then I've come to the right address," said the man in grey, shutting his notebook with a snap. "You're on the list of applicants." "How come?" asked Mr. Figaro, who was still at a loss. "It's like this, my dear sir," said the man in grey. "You're wasting your life cutting hair, lathering faces and swapping idle chit-chat. When you're dead, it'll be as if you'd never existed. If you only had the time to lead the right kind of life, you'd be quite a different person. Time is all you need, right?" "That's just what I was thinking a moment ago," mumbled Mr. Figaro, and he shivered because it was getting colder and colder in spite of the door being shut. "You see," said the man in grey, puffing contentedly at his small cigar, "you need more time. But how are you going to find it? By saving it, of course. You, Mr. Figaro, are wasting time in a totally irresponsible way. Let me prove it to you by simple arithmetic. There are 60 seconds in a minute and 60 minutes in an hour. Are you with me so far?" "Of course," said Mr. Figaro. Agent number XYQ384B produced a piece of grey chalk and scrawled some figures on the mirror. 60 times 60 is 3,600, which makes 3,600 seconds in an hour. There are 24 hours in a day, so multiply 3,600 by 24 and to find the number of seconds in a day, and you arrive at a figure of 86,400. There are 365 days in a year, as you know, which makes 31,536,000 seconds in a year, or 315,360,000 seconds in 10 years. How long do you reckon you'll live, Mr. Figaro?" "Well," stammered Mr. Figaro, thoroughly disconcerted by now, "I hope to live to 70 or 80, God willing." "Very well," pursued the man in grey. "Let's call it 70 to be on the safe side. Multiply 315,360,000 by 7 and you get a grand total of 2,207,520,000 seconds. He chalked this figure up on the mirror in outsized numerals. 2207520000 and underlined it several times. That, Mr. Figaro, is the extent of the capital at your disposal. Mr. Figaro gulped and wiped his brow, feeling quite dizzy. He'd never realized how rich he was. Yes, said the agent, nodding and puffing at his small grey cigar. It's an impressive figure, isn't it? But let's continue. How old are you now, Mr. Figaro? 42, the barber mumbled. He suddenly felt guilty, as if he'd committed a fraud of some kind. And how long do you sleep at night on average? Around 8 hours, Mr. Figaro admitted. The agent did some lightning calculations. The squeak of his chalk as it raced across the mirror set Mr. Figaro's teeth on edge. 42 years at 8 hours a night makes 441,504,000 seconds. We'll have to write that off, I'm afraid. How much of the day do you devote to work, Mr. Figaro? Another 8 hours or so, Mr. Figaro said, apologetically. Then we'll have to write off the same amount again, the agent pursued relentlessly. You also spend a certain proportion of the day eating. How many hours would you say, counting all meals? I don't exactly know, Mr. Figaro said nervously. 2 hours maybe? That sounds on the low side to me, said the agent, but assuming it's correct, we get a figure of 110,376,000 seconds in 42 years. To continue, you live alone with your elderly mother, as we know. You spend a good hour with the old woman every day. That's to say, you sit and talk to her, although she's so deaf she can scarcely hear a word. That counts as more time wasted. 55,188,000 seconds to be precise. You also keep a budgeteria, a needless extravagance whose demands on your time amount to 15 minutes a day, or 13,797,000 seconds in 42 years. But Mr. Figaro broke in imploringly. Don't interrupt, snapped the agent, his chalk racing faster and faster across the mirror. Your mother's arthritic as well as deaf, so you have to do most of the housework. You go shopping, clean shoes, and perform other chores of a similar nature. How much time does that consume daily? An hour maybe, but... So you've already squandered another 55,188,000 seconds, Mr. Figaro. We also know you go to the cinema once a week. Sing with a social club once a week, go drinking twice a week, and spend the rest of your evenings reading or gossiping with friends. In short, you devote some 3 hours a day to useless pastimes that have lost you another 165,564,000 seconds. The agent broke off. What's the matter, Mr. Figaro? Aren't you feeling well? No, said the barber. Yes, I mean, please excuse me. I'm almost through, said the agent. First, though, we must touch on a rather personal aspect of your life. Your little secret, if you know what I mean. Mr. Figaro was so cold that his teeth had started to chatter. So you know about that too? He muttered feebly. I didn't think anyone knew except me and Miss Daria. There's no room for secrets in the world of today, his inquisitor broke in. Look at the matter rationally and realistically, Mr. Figaro, and answer me one thing. Do you plan to marry Miss Daria? No, Mr. Figaro, I couldn't do that. Quite so, said the man in grey. Being paralyzed from the waist down, she will have to spend the rest of her life in a wheelchair. Yet you visit her every day for half an hour and take her flowers. Why? She's always so pleased to see me, Mr. Figaro replied, close to tears. But looked at objectively from your own point of view, said the agent, it's time wasted. 27,594,000 seconds of it to date. Furthermore, if we allow for your habit of sitting at the window for a quarter of an hour every night, musing on the day's events, we have to write off yet another 13,797,000 seconds. Very well, let's see how much time that makes in all. He drew a line under the long column of figures and added them up with the rapidity of a computer. The sum on the mirror now looked like this. Sleep, work, meals, mother, Bulgaria, shopping, friends, social club, Miss Daria, daydreaming, makes a grand total of 1,324,512,000 seconds. "And that figure," said the man in grey, rapping the mirror with his chalk so sharply that it sounded like a burst of machine gun fire, "that figure represents the time you've wasted up to now. What do you say to that, Mr. Figaro?" Mr. Figaro said nothing. He slumped into a chair in the corner of the shop and mopped his brow with a handkerchief, sweating hard despite the icy atmosphere. The man in grey nodded gravely. "Yes, you're quite right, my dear sir. You've used up more than half of your original capital. Now let's see how much of that leaves of your 42 years. 1 year is 31,536,000 seconds, and that multiplied by 42 comes to 1,324,512,000 seconds. Beneath the previous total he wrote, total time available 1,324,512,000 seconds. Time lost to date 1,324,512,002. Balance 0 seconds. Then he pocketed his chalk and waited for the sight of all the zeros to take effect, which they did. "So that's all my life amounts to," thought Mr. Figaro, absolutely shattered. He was so impressed by the elaborate sum, which had come out perfectly, that he was ready to accept whatever advice the stranger had to offer. It was one of the tricks the man in grey used to dupe prospective customers. Agent number XYQ384B broke the silence. "Can you really afford to go on like this?" he said blandly. "Wouldn't you prefer to start saving right away, Mr. Figaro?" Mr. Figaro nodded mutely, blue-lipped with cold. "For example," came the agent's grey voice in his ear, "if you'd started saving even 1 hour a day 24 years ago, you would now have a credit balance of 26,280,000 seconds. 2 hours a day would have saved you twice that amount, of course, or 52,560,000. And I ask you, Mr. Figaro, what are 2 measly little hours in comparison with a sum of that magnitude?" "Nothing," cried Mr. Figaro. "A mere flea bite." "I'm glad you agree," the agent said smoothly. "And if we calculate how much you could have saved that way after another 20 years, we arrive at the handsome figure of 105,120,000 seconds. And the whole of that capital, Mr. Figaro, would have been freely available to you at the age of 62. "Fantastic," stammered Mr. Figaro, wide-eyed with awe. "But that's not all," the agent pursued. "The best is yet to come. The Timesaving Bank not only takes care of the time you save, it pays you interest on it as well. In other words, you end up with more than you put in." "How much more?" Mr. Figaro asked breathlessly. "That's up to you," the agent told him. "It depends on how much time you save and how long you leave it on deposit with us." "Leave it on deposit?" Mr. Figaro asked. "How do you mean?" "It's quite simple. If you don't withdraw the time you save for 5 years, we credit you with the same amount again. Your savings double every 5 years. Do you follow? They are worth 4 times as much after 10 years, 8 times as much after 15, and so on. Say you'd started saving a mere 2 hours a day 20 years ago. By your 62nd birthday, or after 40 years in all, you'd have had 256 times as much in the bank as you originally put in. That would mean a credit balance of 26,910,720,000 seconds." And the agent produced his chalk again and wrote the figure on the mirror. 26,910,720,000. "You can see for yourself, Mr. Figaro," he went on, smiling thinly for the first time. "You would have accumulated over 10 times your entire lifespan just by saving a couple of hours a day for 20 years, for 40 years. If that's not a paying proposition, I don't know what is." "You're right," Mr. Figaro said wearily. "It certainly is. What a fool I was not to start saving time years ago. It didn't dawn on me till now, and I have to admit I'm appalled." "No need to be," the man in grey said soothingly. "None at all. It's never too late to save time. You can start today if you want to." "Of course I want to," exclaimed Mr. Figaro. "What do I have to do?" The agent raised his eyebrows. "Surely you know how to save time, my dear sir. Work faster, for instance, and stick to essentials. Spend only 15 minutes on each customer instead of the usual half an hour, and avoid time-wasting conversations. Reduce the hour you spend with your mother by half. Better still, put her in a nice, cheap old folks' home where someone else can look after her. That'll save you a whole hour a day. Get rid of that useless budgeria. See Mysteria once every 2 weeks, if at all. Give up your 15-minute review of the day's events. Above all, don't squander so much of your precious time on singing, reading, and hobnobbing with your so-called friends. Incidentally, I also advise you to hang a really accurate clock on the wall so you can time your apprentice to the nearest minute." "Fine," Mr. Figaro said. "I can manage all that, but what about the time I save? Do I have to pay it in, and if so, where? Or should I keep it somewhere safe till you collect it? How does the system operate?" The man in grey gave another thin-lipped smile. "Don't worry, we'll take care of that. Rest assured, we won't mislay a single second of the time you save. You will find you haven't any left over." "All right," Mr. Figaro said dazedly. "I'll take your word for it." "You can do so with complete confidence, my dear sir." The agent rose to his feet. "And now permit me to welcome you to the ranks of the great time-saving movement. You're a truly modern and progressive member of the community, Mr. Figaro. I congratulate you." So saying, he picked up his hat and briefcase. "One moment," said Mr. Figaro. "Shouldn't there be some form of contract? Oughtn't I to sign something? Don't I get a policy of some kind?" Agent number XYQ384B, who had already reached the door, turned and regarded Mr. Figaro with faint annoyance. "What on earth for?" he demanded. "Time saving can't be compared with any other kind of saving. It calls for absolute trust on both sides. Your word is good enough for us, especially as you can't go back on it. We'll take care of your savings, though how much you save is entirely up to you. We never bring pressure to bear on our customers. Good day, Mr. Figaro." On that note, the agent climbed into his smart grey car and purred off. Mr. Figaro gazed after him, knitting his brow. Although he was gradually becoming warmer again, he felt sick and wretched. The air still reeked of smoke from the agent's cigar, a dense blue haze that was slow to disperse. Not till the smoke had finally gone did Mr. Figaro begin to feel better. But as it faded, so did the figures chalked up on the mirror, and by the time they had vanished altogether, Mr. Figaro's recollection of his visitor had vanished too. He forgot the man in grey, but not his new resolution, which he believed to be his alone. The determination to save time now, so as to be able to begin a new life sometime in the future, had embedded itself in his soul like a poisoned arrow. When the first customer of the day turned up, Mr. Figaro gave him a surly reception. By doing no more than was absolutely necessary and keeping his mouth shut, he got through in 20 minutes instead of the usual 30. From now on, he subjected every customer to the same treatment. Although he ceased to enjoy his work, that was of secondary importance. He engaged 2 assistants in addition to his apprentice and watched them like a hawk to see they didn't waste a moment. Every move they made was geared to a precise timetable, in accordance with the notice that now adorned the wall of the barbershop. Time saved is time doubled. Mr. Figaro wrote Miss Daria a brief business-like note, regretting that pressure of work would prevent him from seeing her in the future. His Budgerier he sold to a pet shop. As for his mother, he put her in an inexpensive old folks' home and visited her once a month. In the belief that the grey stranger's recommendations were his own decisions, he carried them out to the letter. Meanwhile, he was becoming increasingly restless and irritable. The odd thing was that no matter how much time he saved, he never had any to spare. In some mysterious way, it simply vanished. Imperceptibly at first, but then quite unmistakably, his days grew shorter and shorter. Almost before he knew it, another week had gone by, and another month, and another year, and another, and another. Having no recollection of the grey stranger's visit, Mr. Figaro should seriously have asked himself where all his time was going, but that was a question never considered by him or any other time-saver. Something in the nature of a blind obsession had taken hold of him, and when he realized to his horror that his days were flying by faster and faster, as he occasionally did, it only reinforced his grim determination to save time. Many other inhabitants of the city were similarly afflicted. Every day more and more people took to saving time, and the more they did so, the more they were copied by others, even by those who had no real desire to join in, but felt obliged to. Radio, television and newspapers daily advertised and extolled the merits of new time-saving gadgets that would one day leave people free to live the right kind of life. Walls and billboards were plastered with posters depicting scenes of happiness and prosperity. Splashed across them in fluorescent lettering were slogans such as "Time savers are going to places fast. The future belongs to time savers. Make more of your life. Save time." The real picture, however, was very different. Admittedly, time savers were better dressed than the people who lived near the old amphitheater. They earned more money and had more to spend, but they looked tired, disgruntled and sour, and there was an unfriendly light in their eyes. They had never heard the phrase, "Why not go and see Momo?" Nor did they have anyone to listen to them in a way that would make them reasonable or conciliatory, let alone happy. Even had they known of such a person, they would have been highly unlikely to pay him or her a visit unless the whole affair could be dealt with in 5 minutes flat, or they would have considered it a waste of time. In their view, even leisure time had to be used to the full, so as to extract the maximum of entertainment and relaxation with the minimum of delay. Whatever the occasion, whether solemn or joyous, time savers could no longer celebrate it properly. Daydreaming they regarded almost as a criminal offense. What they could endure least of all, however, was silence. For when silence fell, they became terrified by the realization of what was happening to their lives. And so, whenever silence threatened to descend, they made a noise. It wasn't a happy sound, of course, like the hubbub in a children's playground, but an angry, ill-tempered din that grew louder every day. It had ceased to matter that people should enjoy their work and take pride in it. On the contrary, Enjoyment merely slowed them down. All that mattered was to get through as much work as possible in the shortest possible time. So notices to that effect were prominently displayed in every factory and office building. They read, "Time is precious, don't waste it." Or, "Time is money, save it." Similar notices hung above business executives' desks and boardrooms in doctors' consulting rooms, shops, restaurants and department stores. Even in schools and kindergartens, no one was left out. Last but not least, the appearance of the city itself changed more and more. Old buildings were pulled down and replaced with modern ones, devoid of all the things that were now thought superfluous. No architect troubled to design houses that suited the people who were to live in them, because that would have meant building a whole range of different houses. It was far cheaper and, above all, more time-saving to make them identical. Huge modern housing developments sprang up on the city's northern outskirts. Endless rows of multi-storied tenements as indistinguishable as peas in a pod. And because the buildings all looked alike, so of course did the streets. They grew steadily longer, stretching away to the horizon in dead straight lines and turning the countryside into a disciplined desert. The lives of the people who inhabited this desert followed a similar pattern. They ran dead straight for as far as they could see. Everything in them was carefully planned and programmed, down to the last move and the last moment of time. People never seemed to notice that, by saving time, they were losing something else. No one cared to admit that life was becoming even poorer, bleaker, and more monotonous. The ones who felt this most keenly were the children, because no one had time for them anymore. But time is life itself, and life resides in the human heart. And the more people saved, the less they had.